Okay. Good afternoon, all. It's good to be back. Sorry, I missed the last couple of weeks. I hope you enjoyed Rabbi Stillman. Yes. Let me just share the screen and we'll get started.
Welcome back.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephen. Okay. So for the last couple of weeks, we've been studying the laws of Truma. Truma being a gift that we give to the Kohanim, and the many laws that we spoke about, both about those giving, how it's given, those who are receiving it, how they receive it, how they eat it, and so on and so forth. An associated set of laws is the laws of Maaser, which is the tithe that we give from our produce, and is a gift to the Leviim. The Truma was a gift to the Kohanim, and what we're going to learn today is some distinctions and some similarities, some things that are very different about Maaser as compared to Truma, and other things that are quite similar. So as the Rambam does at the beginning of every new section, he'll tell us exactly what these laws are going to be elaborating on. So Hilchas Maaser, this is the laws of Maaser. They contain one positive commandment to separate the first tithe from the crops in each of the years when crops are sown, and give it to the Leviim. This mitzvah is explained in the ensuing chapters. Tithe obviously means 10% of whatever it is that you're going to be giving, whatever type of crops it will be, and it's given to the Leviim. Halacha 1. After separating the great teruma, which is all the laws that we've spoken about, the first gift that is given to the Kohanim, one should separate 1/10 of the remaining produce, and this is called Maaser Rishon in the first tithe. Concerning it, the pasuk says, for the tithes of the children of Israel, that they will separate to Hashem. These tithes are given to Levites, Leviim. And here it starts to get interesting, right? It's given to males and females. As the verse says, and I shall give the Levites all of the tithes of the children of Israel as an inheritance. If you look in the Hebrew, the pasuk says, V'livnei Levi. It means the children of the families of Levi, not specifying male per se, and therefore it's a gift can be given either to male or female Levites. Halacha 2. An Israelite is permitted to partake of the first tithe, right? So here's a distinction. The truma, we know, once it's separated, is holy and cannot be eaten by anybody other than the Kohen and all the additional conditions that we've learned about. But when it comes to the Maaser per se is not holy and therefore not forbidden to an Israelite to partake of it. And it may be eaten in a state of ritual impurity because it's not holy. Likewise, the Levi who's eating it or anybody that's eating it does not have to be in a state of purity, which is the case of someone eating from a Kohen, eating of the Truma. Now, whenever the term holy or redemption is used with regard to the tithes, the intent is the second tithe. So we'll see that is distinct to what we're talking about specifically here, which is the first tithe. Because in addition to the first tithe, we'll learn that there's the second tithe, and then there's the tithe that's given to the poor people, and so on. But that phrase, which indicates that the food itself is distinct and unique, refers specifically to the second tithe, which we'll learn about in more detail. What is the source from which we learn that the first tithe is ordinary produce? So again, we have continuation there. The pasuk says, "V'nechshav lachem trumaschem kadogon min hagoyim, v'chamleya min hayokim," and your truma will be considered for you as grain from your grain heap and the fullness of the vat. Just as a grain heap and a vat contain ordinary produce, so too, once trumas maaser has been separated from the first tithe, it is ordinary produce in all regards. What we see over here is that once I've given the tithe, I've taken 10% of my produce, I've given it to the Levi. So there still remains an obligation for the Levi to take off a gift and give it to the Kohen. That's called Trumat Maaser. So long as there's a Trumat Maaser, which is a portion that's going to the Kohen, well, then there is a distinct portion that will be holy. But the rest of it, that which is remains just the maaser, just the gift to the Levi, that will not be considered holy, as indicated in this verse. For this reason, when the daughter of a Levite has been taken captive, or she engaged in forbidden relations, she can be given tithes and she may partake of it. Remember, we learned in great detail certain types of relationships that would disqualify a kohenet from partaking of teruma because of being involved in or engaged in relationships that were forbidden to her, because the truma itself remains holy. That is not the case when it comes to eating maaser and the daughters of a Levi or the female Levites who could eat it, irrespective of those type of circumstances, which may have been unbecoming or engaged in some type of prohibitive behavior. Nonetheless, they could still eat from the maaser. Whenever there was a report that a woman's husband died, or one witness testified that he died, she married and then her husband appears, our sages penalized her and ruled that she is forbidden to partake of the tithes. So this last detail that the Rambam is giving us over here is actually a rabbinic law. Technically, there is no way for a Levite woman to be disqualified from eating maaser. But in this very unusual situation, where a woman was married, her husband goes missing, and because the Chachamim are concerned about agunot, a woman who's bound to a marriage and she would not be able to remarry, so they allowed certain leniencies that if certain level of testimony came forth, like one witness that said that he had died, the rabbis allow her to marry based on that testimony. But what happens if her original husband shows up? Now, practically speaking, she cannot remain married to the guy that she's now married, because she began her relationship with this guy as a married woman, as it turns out. She also cannot go back to her original husband because she is engaged willfully in intimate relations with someone who's not her husband. So she would need to be divorced from both of them. And because in that instance, although she was following kind of the rules that allowed her to remarry, but it's a rule that was a leniency, the rabbis penalize her because it's considered that she is to some level at fault over here. But so that's the only exception when it comes to being engaged in what turns out to be a forbidden relationship that would disqualify a woman from eating the maaser. Otherwise, all other types of forbidden engagements, sexual engagements, would not disqualify. Okay, again, and this is something that one of those areas that is because maaser is not fundamentally holy and is therefore very different to teruma. Halacha 3. The Levites and the priests should separate the first tithes so that they can separate truma maaser from it. That means they should also separate if they've got a stock of grain that has not been separated tithes, they must separate tithes. Similarly, the priests must separate other types of truma and tithes for themselves. Since the priests receive all types of agricultural gifts, is it possible then to partake of the produce without these separations having been made? So the pasuk says, and so shall you separate, also you. You includes the Levites, also includes the priests. In other words, what we're saying is like this: if the gifts such as maaser and truma and so on anyway come to the kohen, we'll see soon that a kohen can be a recipient of maaser, not just a Levi. So why, if they have a pile of grain, a pile of grain that is no gifts has been taken off, is called tevel. You're not allowed to partake of it. But if as we're going to see, is all those gifts anyway, the kohen takes for himself, it's just about separating it. Is it really necessary for them to separate it? So he said, yes. The kohen themselves would have to separate a pile of grain, even if those separated gifts go to them. And this is based on the verse. It says, Kain tarimu gam atem, so you shall separate them. So you shall also separate them. That's the additional words, includes the Levi and a kohen, need to separate the gifts of the truma and the maaser and the trumas maaser and so on. Halacha 4, we do not expropriate the tithes from the priests. That means like this: if somebody gave, if they've separated tithes, they can keep tithes. Or even if a Jewish person gave tithe to the kohen and not to the Levi, you don't take it away from them. So even though in the first instance one should give tithes not to the kohen got his truma, but to the Levi. If it was given to the Kohen has the right to keep it. When you, again, because the pasuk says, when you take from the children of Israel, the critical thing is once it's separated from Bnei Israel. Similarly, none of the presents given to the priest must be given from one priest to another priest. You can't take it away. Interestingly, because we have this idea that the tithe does not have to be given to the Levi, even though ideally it's given to the Levi, we had a period in history when the Jewish people came back from the first exile to rebuild the second temple. Here the Rambam tells us Ezra penalized the Levites in his time because they did not ascend to Jerusalem with him, at least not en masse. But the Kohanim were there serving in the temple. And therefore he ordained that the first tithe should be given solely to the priest. Halacha 5. When a person partakes of his produce while it is tevel, or a Levite partakes of the tithes while they are tevel, remember, a lady gets 10% of what my produce was. From that 10%, he has to give a gift to the Kohanim. So long as he has not taken out what he had to, it's also not completely ready for him to eat. Although they are liable for death at the hand of heaven, they are not liable to make reimbursements to the owners. This is derived, and they shall separate to God. It implies that the recipients do not have any share in them until they have been separated. In other words, even though I'm obligated to give to the Kohen a gift or to the Levi a gift, and let's say I partook of my produce before I gave that gift, I'm liable for, like he says here, what is death of heaven. But I don't have to pay the Levi what I've taken from him because it never actually belonged to him until I separated and give it to him. Likewise, the portion that the Levi would give to the Kohen is not actually the Kohen's, it's just my obligation to give it to the Kohen. Okay, in the diaspora, now the first part of the Halacha is talking about in the land of Israel, where the separation of these gifts, the Meiser and the Trumas Meiser, is a biblical mandate. Okay, it's a mitzvah from the Torah. In the diaspora, in certain lands outside the land of Israel, where one is still required to give Meiser and Truma and so on, as we've learned, but it's only of a rabbinic nature, there it is permitted for a person to continue eating and afterwards separate Truma and the tithes. In other words, in Halacha 5, what we're saying is if somebody says, let me start eating from this, and then I'll take off some after at the end of the day. He's not allowed to do that. If you eat from tevel, you're transgressing a prohibition. Okay. Halacha 6. We can separate tithes from produce in one place for produce in another place. Again, this is unique to Meiser as opposed to Truma. Truma, we said you have to take from those collection of produce that is in the same vicinity. But when it comes to tithing, you might have one field of grain here and one over there. You could take from one and tithe on behalf of the other. They need not be grouped together. We do not have a separate tithes from one species for another species. So it must be apples for apples. You can't take apples for pears or oranges. Nor from produce for which we are obligated to separate tithes for produce which we are exempt from separating. Nor from produce for which we are exempt from separating tithes for produce from which such a separation is required. So it must be of the same type and the same level of obligation. And then you could take, even if they're not in the same vicinity, you could take from one group of produce for another group of produce that also belongs to you. If one made a separation in any of the above instances, the produce separated is not considered a tithes. You would have to tithe again from that which you are obligated of its kind. Halacha 7. Whenever we said with regard to Truma, that Truma may not be separated from one type of produce for another, tithes may not be separated from one such type of produce for another such type. So we're going to cast our eye back to the laws of Truma. And whenever we said that the separation of Truma from one type of produce is acceptable after the fact, now certain things you couldn't do lachatchila, as we said in the first instance, but if you did it, it was acceptable. So again, if the same thing would apply to the tithes. If one separates tithes from such produce, it is acceptable. Whenever produce is exempt from the obligation to have Truma separated, it is also exempt from the obligation to have tithes separated. I guess the right example that comes to mind is Hefker. All those individuals who may separate Truma may separate the tithes. So the person separating, okay, it's the same criteria. And all those concerning whom it was said that they should not separate Truma. But if they did separate it, the separation is effective. So too, if they separate tithe, the separation is effective. Whenever a person's separation of the truma is not effective, his separation of the tithes is also not effective. Okay, halacha 8. When a person tells a colleague, I will tithe through your agency, he does not have to stand with him to see whether he tithes or did not tithe. Basically, we know that you can have a shliach, someone, an agent of yours, separate the required tithes or truma from your produce. What the Rambam is talking about in this halacha is two distinct scenarios. In the first scenario, what happened is I come over to you, Ken, and I say, Ken, I see you've got all your produce. I'm going to go into your field. I'll separate tithes for you. Okay? So long as I wait, I don't know, as much time as it would reasonably take for me to take those tithes, you don't have to actually witness me taking those tithes. But you can go ahead and eat from that produce, fully assuming that it's no longer tevel and it's permissible to you. If, however, I am instructed by you to take the tithes, then you would have to actually oversee me doing that, or have some type of verification that I've done it before you eat from the rest of the produce. It's not good enough just to wait out the time. You actually have to have a verification. Okay, so that's halacha 8. If I come on my own accord and say I'm going to tithe on your behalf, you don't have to wait for verification. You just have to wait the time that reasonably would take me to do the job. If you instruct me to do it, you'd actually have to verify it. You must stand with him, as it says. Halacha 9. The obligation to tithe carobs is only rabbinic in origin, for they are not eaten by most people. Bitter almonds, whether large or small, are exempt, for they are not considered food. It is pointed out that when he says carobs, he's talking about a certain type of carobs that would generally are not edible. Similar to these almonds, he's talking about bitter almonds, which again, are also not generally used for food. Obviously, regular type of carobs that was more regularly eaten, or sweet almonds, whatever, that people do eat and is considered food, those you would have to tithe from. Halacha 10, a tree that is planted inside a house is exempt from obligations of the tithes. As indicated by the pasuk, you shall certainly tithe all the produce of your crops that grow in the field. The pasuk emphasizes crops that grow in the field. Therefore, if it's something that's indoor, technically, it's not part of this obligation. It appears to me that tithes must be separated from this produce according to rabbinic law. The Rambam says, even though biblically it's not obligated, for one is required to tithe the fruits of a fig tree that stands in a courtyard if it was harvested at one time. So he says, because that we have clear halachot about, he says similarly then, even trees that are in the house, it would seem to him that according to rabbinic law, you would have to separate tithes. There is an exception of produce that is grown in the house. He said, when onions stored in a home grew roots next to each other, even if they grew roots into the earth of a loft, they are exempt from tithes. In other words, what happened here was that a vegetable started producing in your home just because it was left there, not because you intentionally planted it there. So it's got two marks against it, right? We said biblically, something that grows in the house, you're not obligated on. The rabbis obligate you to do so, but they only obligate you to do so if you intentionally plant it. In the example he's talking about here is that it's growing in your home, but it was never planted intentionally in your home, and therefore even rabbinically it would be exempt from tithes. What happens if a landslide covered them and they are thus open to the skies? In other words, it was indoors and now it's outdoors. It is as if they have been planted in the field and one is obligated to tithe. Halacha 12. The following law applies to when someone is protecting his field because of grapes. So the halacha really is going to speak to the idea of hefker. I've got a field, I've got a vineyard, I've got grapes there. And another person comes along and collects the figs that remain in that field. There happens to be a couple of fig trees there, but it's not my main concern of that field. I have a vineyard, there's a few fig trees there, and I care for my vineyard. So here's the question. Somebody comes along and gathers together figs. Or he was guarding his field because of the zucchini and squash, and another person comes and gathered the grapes, which were scattered in the field. When it is known that the owner of the field is concerned with the leftover produce, it is forbidden to take it. Doing so is stealing. Hence, tithes and truma must be separated from the crops. If the owner of the field is not concerned with it, it is permitted to take it. It's not theft, and therefore it's also exempt from the tithes. In other words, here's the thing. The halacha is that you are not required to take truma meiser from something that is considered ownerless. The scenario that the Rambam is developing for us over here is that your primary concern in the field is one product, but there happens to be a little bit of another product there. And he wants to now determine whether or not somebody would have to take Meiser from that. So the critical question we have to ask is, it's true that so-and-so is guarding the field for the grapes, but would he be concerned if somebody came along and took the figs? If he wouldn't be concerned at all, that indicates that it's absolute hefker, meaning that a person who takes it is not stealing, and therefore the person, because therefore also would not have to take Meiser. But if the situation was that he's there primarily for the grapes, but he's also, in a secondary way, concerned for the figs. So if somebody would come along and take it, it would be considered thievery. Therefore, those things he himself would also have to take tithes from, even though it's only something secondary in his concern. It's not ownerless. Halacha 13. Only the most choice product should be separated as tithes. We learned this about Truma as well. You've got to take from the best. As it says, when you separate the choice portion from it, and it will be considered for the Levites as the produce of the grain heap and the produce of the vat. Just as the Levites must separate the choicest portions of the tithes, the Israelites who separate from the grain heap and the vat separate the choicest portions. Right? So when the Levi gives to the Kohen, and when the Yisrael gives to the Levi or to the Kohen, always got to give the best of the produce. Halacha 14. We may not separate tithes by estimation, right? Unlike Truma, this is a different. Like Truma, you're not allowed to actually measure it exactly. Remember, the Torah didn't give an exact amount, so you're allowed to get a sense of what you got, and you have a kind of guesstimate of what you're aiming for, 40 to 60th, different amounts. But when it comes to tithing, you're not allowed to estimate. One must do it through measuring, whether either measuring, weighing it, or numbers. In other words, if you have 10 apples, one has to go to Truma. One who is precise in the measurement is praiseworthy. When one gives an extra amount as the tithes, his tithes are flawed because untied produce is mixed within it. The remainder of his produce has ever been made fit for use. See, here's the scenario. Just trying to remember. If I have 100 apples, let's say, I think Rambam himself expounds on this. Say like this: when a person separates a portion of the tithes, they're not considered as tithes. Instead, it is as if someone divided the grain heap. He must have a separate from the portion, set aside the tithes that are appropriate for it. What's implied? So let's say a person has 100 sa'ah. He sets aside, oh no, sorry, that's a different halacha. Let's go back to 14. Let me explain what happened. Let's say you had 100 apples. Now we said you must give exactly 10, right? If you're giving it by number. Let's say you gave 15. So what happens? What happens is from the other 85, there are the subsequent gifts that you need to give, depending on the year, as we'll learn. Either the second tithe or the tithe to the poor, and so on. And that's fine, you can do that. But now you've taken 15, you've given it to the Levi. How many of those were actually Maaser? Only 10 of them. The Levite gets an extra 5. Now, technically speaking, those extra 5 would require an additional gift to have been taken from them. And that's what it means when he says you're confusing or your tithes are flawed. And that's why we don't do it. The tithe must be exact. Now back to the next halacha. The next halacha is like this. Let's say you had 100 apples, you're supposed to give 10 apples, but you only separated 5 apples, not 10. What do you do? So the Rambam uses a similar example. He says, what's implied? Person had 100 sa'ah. He set aside 5 sa'ah as tithes. These 5 sa'ah are not considered as tithes. He cannot separate tithes for these 5 sa'ah from another source. Instead, he should separate half a sa'ah from them. It is their tithes. So you can't, until you take the full amount, you haven't given anything. But once you've taken part of an amount, you can no longer take from another pile. Remember, we said earlier that when it comes to tithes, unlike Truma, you can take from one unassociated pile for another. But once you start taking, it's not yet tithe until you've taken the full tithe. But once you've done that, you have to complete the tithe from this pile. You can't take from another pile on behalf of this one. Final halacha for today. When a person separates the first tithe, he should recite a blessing first. Just as one recites a blessing before observing any of the mitzvahs. Similarly, he should recite a blessing before separating the second tithe. The tithe given to the poor and the tithe of the tithe. He should recite a blessing for each one individually. If he made all the separations one directly after the other without speaking in between, he should include them all in one blessing, praising Hashem who commands us to separate the trumas and the ma'aseh. Okay, so that's the first chapter in the new set of halachot. Like I said, good to see everyone, good to be back. And yeshikach.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you. Thank you very
Okay,
much.
sei gesund. Have a wonderful day for everyone.
Sei gesund, Rabbi.
Sei gesund. I'll see you next week, please, God.
Cheers, eh?
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.